In the description box, you will find the rest of the videos from this series. So here's where we are at right now. So 6 months after being snubbed by Leonard in Baltimore, Hagler reduced himself to having to do a television skit in a boxing ring with Leonard and an 80-year-old Bob Hope. An emergency appendectomy put an end to Leonard participating in the skit. They replaced him with Roberto Duran. Bob Hope himself boxed in his youth under the name Packy West. 2 nights earlier, there was a 154-pound matchup between Sean Mannion and Inchil Bake. Mannion was an Irish fighter who resided in America. Inchil Bake was a Korean. The winner would become the mandatory challenger for the winner out of Davey Moore and Roberto Duran. Davey Moore was the WBA champion at the time. Mannion won the fight, and the following morning, NBC dispatched a private plane to fly Hagler and his wife, alongside Goody and Pat Petronelli, to Washington. Duran, who had been in training in New Jersey, arrived by train. Before he left camp, somebody else had picked up Duran's equipment bag, and when he started to take his stuff out, he had 2 right boxing boots. He held them out and stared at them, not saying a word. Somebody who was close to the situation had a brand new pair of sneakers that hadn't been worn, and they had the same shoe size as Duran. The problem was, Duran had an endorsement contract with Viceroy. It said Viceroy on his trunks and his shoes, and he figured if he didn't wear their gear, he wouldn't get paid. Somehow he managed to stuff his left foot into the right boot, and he wore it that way throughout the skit. It must have been pretty painful. Hagler and Duran shared a dressing room for the Bob Hope show. As they rehearsed for the skit, Louis Spada told Bob Arum, "I don't believe it. They're almost the same size." Indeed, at 5'8.5", Duran was just an inch shorter than Hagler. Hagler now weighed just a few pounds less. It occurred to both men that a matchup between the middleweight and the long-time lightweight champion might not be such a far-fetched notion after all. Hagler was a week away from his fight against Wilfred Scipien. Hagler and Duran got on pretty well, and they were embraced by the rest of the star-studded cast. George Burns, George C. Scott, Brooke Shields, Sheena Easton, Cheryl Tiggs, and Ronald Reagan, the president, was there. They all wanted to meet Marvin Hagler. The skit was more slapstick than boxing. It went well. Afterwards, Duran took another train back to New Jersey, while Hagler and his party flew back to the Cape, or tried to, due to bad weather, and they couldn't land in Hyannis. The plane didn't have instruments, so they couldn't land in Boston or Providence either. Finally, they turned around and flew back to Washington. Their rooms in a downtown hotel were gone, but the party managed to rent free at a hotel near National Airport. The Petronellis took one, and Bertha Hagler took another. Pat and Goody would not let Marvin sleep in the same room with his wife a week before the fight, so Marvin had to bunk with someone else in the camp. Hagler got back to Provincetown on Sunday, and 6 nights later he knocked out Scipien in 4. The most significant aspect of an otherwise unremarkable evening was the fact that it was the first title fight in history to be recognized by 3 sanctioning bodies. Following Mancini's fatal beating of Dirk Koo Kim, the WBC had adopted a 12-round limit for its title matches. Hagler, who held both the WBC and WBA titles, still insisted on fighting 15 rounds, the time-honored championship limit. As part of a long-standing arrangement, the 2 organizations alternated the oversight role in Hagler's defenses, and although the WBA still had a 15-round limit, it sided with its rival's organization in this instance. Both threatened to strip Hagler if the bout were scheduled for the traditional distance. Since disposing of Antuofermo in their 1981 rematch, Hagler had defended the middleweight title 4 more times. That October, he had stopped Mustafa Hamsho in 11 rounds. It was a bloodbath, In March 1982, he knocked out Emanuel Steward's middleweight Caveman Lee in the first round. And that autumn in Italy, he stopped Oblagimus, the WBA's top-rated challenger, in 5. In February 1983 in Worcester, he demolished Tony Simpson, the WBC's #1 mandatory, in 6. Although none of them had lasted that long, all 4 bouts had been scheduled for 15 rounds. In a failed palace coup at a WBA convention the previous winter, New Jersey's Bob Lee had lost out in his bid for the presidency of that organization, but he remained the head of the United States Boxing Association. A few days before Hagler and Cyprian, Lee announced the formation of a new world sanctioning body and offered to oversee the 15-round middleweight fight as his first championship bout. At that time, Lee's hastily formed group was called the USBA International, but within days it would change its name to the International Boxing Federation, the IBF. The WBC and the WBA reluctantly came on board and collected their sanctioning fees. Steve Wainwright distributed buttons describing the Hagler-Cyprian fight as boxing's first Triple Crown. Having successfully defended his championship for the 7th time, Hagler turned up in New York a few weeks later to watch his sparring partner from the Bob Hope special continue his comeback against Davey Moore. Obviously, we're talking about Roberto Duran. Moore had won the WBA version of the 154-pound championship in February 1982 when he knocked out Tadisha Mihara in Tokyo. The other half of the title now belonged to Tommy Hearns. 3 months later, after his loss to Leonard in the showdown, Hearns had initiated his campaign as a junior middleweight by outpointing veteran Ernie Singletary in the Bahamas, a bout that took place in a rundown baseball field outside Nassau on the undercard of what would be Ali's final fight, a 10-round loss to Trevor Burbeck. For the greatest, it had been a bizarre and bittersweet farewell, since the amateurish promoters had neglected to provide a supply of extra gloves for the card. Cornermen were ordered not to cut off their fighters' gloves, and the same 2 pairs were passed along from one bout to the next, meaning that Ali probably wore the same sweaty gloves in losing to Burbeck that Hearns had used in beating Singletary several hours earlier. Wow. And since no one had remembered to bring a bell, the Bahamians borrowed a fair approximation from a neighbouring farm. The conclusion of Ali's storied career was signalled by the tinkling of a cowbell. In 1982, the Hitman had knocked out the Mexican veteran Marcos Giraldo in the first round of a February bout in Las Vegas. There were 2 attempts to make a fight with Hagler, but legal problems and injuries had intervened. Hearns fought next in Detroit that July, where he knocked out an unbeaten middleweight named Jeff McCracken in 8. Those fights set the stage for a December challenge to Wilfred Benitez in New Orleans. Sharing the bill with another title fight on the Don King promoted card, Wilfredo Gomez stopped Luke Pintor in the 14th round of a spectacular WBC junior featherweight bout. Hearns scored a majority decision in becoming just the 2nd man to defeat Benitez, but he paid dearly for the win. In the 8th round, he had rocked Benitez with a right hand. The punch landed with such force that it shattered several small bones in his wrist and popped them through the linear muscles at the back of his hand. Tommy fought the last 7 rounds using only his left, but still won easily on 2 of the 3 scorecards. Dick Young had it 146-137, and Tony Castellano had it 144-139. The other judge, Lou Filippo, had it an unaccountably level 142-142. The outcome confirmed yet again what many who had been following his career already knew, that beyond his hitman power, Thomas Hearns was a terrific boxer. He didn't only beat the acrobatic Benitez at his own game, but he did it with one hand. After recovering from his appendectomy, Leonard once again found himself in Hagler's neighborhood when he was invited to address an assemblage of Harvard students. It was Ray's first visit to the Cambridge campus, where in those long-ago post-Olympic dreams he had hoped to go to law school. I had done a lot of public speaking by then, and I was comfortable before a microphone, recalled Ray. But I was downright nervous after that one. I kept asking myself, those kids are about to graduate from Harvard. What am I going to tell them? Despite his apprehension, Leonard was a hit. You are blessed, and I'm blessed, Leonard told the students that day. We've each been given God-given talents. Mine just happens to be beating people up. Davey Moore was a 4-1 favorite against Duran. He had already made 3 defenses of the WBA title, winning all by knockout. In a newspaper survey of 24 boxing writers in town to cover the fight, only 4 picked Cholo to win. Then all of a sudden, Davey Moore needed an extra hour to lose 2 pounds to make the weight, while Duran made weight with ease. Davey Moore, although a Bronx-born champion, the loyalties of the Madison Square Garden crowd were divided, as a massive Hispanic contingent turned out to support Duran on his return to the scene of some of his greatest triumphs. On his 32nd birthday, over 20,000, the largest Garden crowd since Ali Frazier, packed the Mecca of boxing to watch Duran administer what turned out to be a brutal, one-sided beating. Enacting a repertoire of his tricks of the trade, the old master humiliated Moore, bullying him around the ring, spinning him like a top, and hitting him with everything from punches to elbows to a thumb that caught Moore squarely in the right eye, which almost immediately closed in the opening round. In the 8th round, after Duran flattened the champion with a straight right, Moore's corner threw in the towel. It was such a rout that referee Ernesto Magana was widely criticized for not having stopped it earlier. Hagler was at ringside and was among the first in the ring to congratulate Duran. Hagler was also the center of attention at the post-fight press conference, where he and Bob Arum were answering questions about his impression of the Duran-Moore fight, which was interrupted by a jubilant conga line headed by Duran. They snaked through the room and headed out the door for what promised to be another all-night party. Duran paused just long enough to shout, "Thank you, Teddy," acknowledging Teddy Bremner. He also acknowledged Hagler with a wave of his hand, as if to say, "And you, I'll see later." As magical as the evening had been, it would be nearly as memorable for a disgraceful episode on the undercard. The supporting acts included a 10-rounder between middleweights Billy Collins Jr. and Luis Resto. Collins from Tennessee was undefeated at 14-0, but largely untested, while Resto, a Puerto Rican from the Bronx, had a 28-2 record. Collins had had several fights on ESPN. Resto had sparred with the likes of Duran and was considered a solid test for Billy, but nobody could foresee the outcome. Resto beat Collins from pillar to post from start to finish. Collins' face was a mass of lumps and bruises, and he barely finished on his feet. After the fight, as Collins' father and trainer, Billy Sr., shook hands with the winner, he said he felt only knuckles. Collins immediately alerted the New York Commission, and Resto's gloves were impounded. Once the gloves were examined, it became clear that Resto's trainer, Carlos Panama Lewis, had surreptitiously removed the horsehair padding from the gloves. Resto might as well have been hitting Collins with a pair of bricks that night. Panama Lewis had always been a mysterious figure around the boxing netherworld. He worked with the likes of Vito Antuofermo before his second fight with Hagler. He famously worked with Aaron Pryor against Arguello at the Orange Bowl before the 13th and 14th rounds. when an aide handed him the water bottle. The HBO cameras caught him saying, "No, not that one. Give me the other bottle that I mixed." Pryor, apparently revived and revitalized by the mixed water, won the fight. The suspicious bottle was never found. The boxing commission in Miami was notably lax, and Pryor did not take the drug test after the bout. Artie Curley, Pryor's cutman in the Arguello fight, insisted that the bottle had contained peppermint schnapps to settle Aaron's stomach. In a home video shot in the dressing room before the fight, Pryor could be heard repeatedly burping. In any case, this time Panama had been caught red-handed. Resto's win was stricken from the books and changed to a no contest. Lewis and Resto were convicted of charges of assault, possession of a dangerous weapon, and conspiracy to influence the outcome of a sporting event. Both were banned from boxing for life. Lewis was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but only served 1. Resto spent 2.5 years in prison. Although prevented from working corners, Panama Lewis continues to pop up in gyms all over the world as an advisor. I still run into him time to time. Billy Collins, he wasn't that lucky. His injuries included a fractured orbital bone and permanent eye damage that prevented him from boxing again. 9 months later, after a night of drinking, he drove his car off a bridge in what his father described as a suicide.